When December hits, life gets chaotic and every grappler starts stressing out about the same things. Losing strength, losing conditioning, falling behind in their jiu-jitsu skills, and they worry about showing up in January feeling like they've lost a step in their grappling athleticism. In today's episode, I'm breaking down the exact strategies that I use for myself and all the athletes that I coach to help them continue making progress even when life gets crazy busy around the holidays with work stuff, and using something called minimum effective dose training to help them continue to maintain their strength and continue to train hard on the mat. If you want to maintain the progress that you've developed over this last year and show up in January feeling dangerous instead of defeated, listen to this entire episode. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Set with Strength podcast. I'm stoked that you're here. I haven't podcasted in what feels like months, and it's been like an absolute ridiculous last couple of months, and I'm so excited to be back on the mic podcasting with you guys. And I'm recording this around Christmas time. It's like early December as of right now. And this episode is really all about that feeling that a lot of us grapplers get every December. Things get busy with the holidays, things get busy at work, pushing towards, to finish up these big projects by the end of the year. We're doing family stuff, we're doing holiday stuff, we're doing, quarter four sprints and all that stuff. And it can be really tough to maintain some of that momentum and some of that progress that you've built all throughout this past year. And I see this time and time again where grapplers will either start to lose some progress or they'll start to fall off a little bit with their training, and they worry about like, man, am I going to lose a bunch of muscle that I worked so hard to build over this last year? Am I going to get weaker? Am I going to lose my jiu-jitsu skills? And that can definitely happen. However, there are some key strategies and protocols that I use for myself and with the athletes that I coach to make sure that we're maintaining the progress and maintaining the strength, the muscle, the conditioning, the skills that we've built over this last year. And there are a few things that contribute to why people lose some of their gains, especially in the months of November and December. And there's even some really interesting data. I honestly couldn't tell you where it's from. It's like, third hand, fourth hand data that I've heard, but there have just been other experts that have talked about some studies that have shown how people on average gain about, across the entire American population, on average, people tend to gain about 5 pounds every single year. And they gain the majority, or I should say, they have an increase in average body weight by about 5 pounds every year. And throughout the year, the time where they gain most of the weight happens in the last 3 months of the year, starting around Halloween or just a couple weeks before Halloween, going all the way through to December. Then people try to get healthy again around January 1st. They lose a little bit of the weight, but they most of the time have an average net gain of about 5 pounds per year, which is crazy. And what tends to happen is we have these things structured in our lives. We have these things set in place with our training, our workouts in the gym, our nutrition. Then the holidays start to throw some wrenches into that. And a lot of grappling athletes worry about losing progress, and they sometimes get caught up with this thing that you can almost call like the forget about it's, where they're just like, you know what, I'm just going to forget about everything. I'm just going to not even worry about my diet at all. I'm going to eat all this crazy junk food. You know what, forget about it. I can't have an amazing workout. I'm not going to work out at all. You know what, forget about it. I can't, make it to all the jiu-jitsu classes I was going to before, so I'm just not going to train at all. And maybe I'll show up on Christmas Eve at open mat, feel absolutely terrible, get completely smashed by everybody, and then be like, okay, January 1st, I'm really going to try showing up again. That attitude of the forget about it is, I think, the secret killer to a lot of grappling athletes' gains that they've worked on throughout the year. And it takes discipline, it takes preparation, it takes consistency to be able to make sure that you don't lose a lot of the progress that you've worked on for the first 11 months of the year, that you start to lose some of that in the last month of the year. Now, there are some specific things that you need to do if you want to be able to maintain that. And some different things that are going to be able to stick around a little bit longer is that when you work on building strength, it's oftentimes the hardest to develop, but it does stick around for a while. You look at different powerlifting athletes, you look at strongman athletes, they will oftentimes take their last heaviest squat 14 to 21 days before a powerlifting meet. So there's like almost 2 to 3 whole weeks where they're not doing maximum effort squats, and yet they still show up on the platform and smash a crazy PR. There are, other athletes that, depending on their sport, if it's a little bit more power-based, if it's a little bit more speed-based, they have to maintain some of that training a little bit closer to competition because there is a little bit of a quicker drop-off. But there is a big difference between maintaining and completely dropping off. There's, even just with a little bit of training, you can maintain strength, maintain muscle mass, maintain your conditioning, your speed, explosive power. That goes a long way, as opposed to just getting the case of the forget about it, and you're just like, you know what, forget about it, I'm not even gonna lift heavy for the next 4 to 5 weeks. That's a completely different thing. And so I encourage you, if you're listening to this podcast episode and you're wondering like, man, like Coach Jay, how do I train during the holidays when things are getting busy? I'm gonna provide you the exact steps and protocols that I would recommend. And so that way you can finish this episode feeling like, okay, it's December, I have a plan. I may not be hitting some crazy all-time lifetime PR, but I'm at least not gonna be losing any strength. And maybe if I, take some extra steps, I can even gain a little bit of strength this month and go from there. I heard this quote one time, and I'm not exactly sure how well it correlates with what's true and what's based on the data, but I heard them say it takes twice as much to gain, half as much to maintain. So if you are currently doing, 10 sets to stimulate muscle growth and you want to, grow a lot more muscle, well, you may need to bump that up to 20 sets per muscle group to really just like maximize your growth potential. But if you were doing 10 sets and you just wanted to maintain the muscle mass that you've already built, you can get away with only doing 5 sets for that muscle group and still maintain a lot of the mass that you've built. And so that's something to keep in mind, that yes, it takes a lot of work to make gains in these different athletic adaptations: strength, hypertrophy, speed and explosive power, conditioning, all that stuff. However, even though it takes a lot to develop those things, we can do a lot less to maintain those things. And that's something that can be difficult to kind of wrap our heads around, because sometimes we think like any step backwards means that we're failing, and that's not always the case. I'm a huge proponent about looking at training through different seasons. When I was finishing up my degree in college, I hardly trained jiu-jitsu at all, and I got super stressed out about it, and I just had to recognize like, man, like this season of life right now is not about jiu-jitsu. As much as I would love for it to be about jiu-jitsu, it ain't about jiu-jitsu. I gotta lock in and make sure that the last 2 months of my entire college career are solely focused on finishing up these senior projects, graduating, and then after that, I can do as much jiu-jitsu as I want. And so when we look at the months of November, the months of December, unless you're competing at ADCC trials in November, or if you're competing at Nogi Worlds in December, for most everyone else, those months are kind of like, they get really full and really busy with work and with family stuff. I am married, I run this company, and I also work for another company, so like December and November get very, very busy for me, and I've just had to learn and accept like, okay, this is the reality. To say yes to one thing is to say no to something else. And so if I'm going to say yes to these family events, which I genuinely want to partake in, because I freaking love Christmas. Christmas, like my family, my wife and I, my parents, my brother, we are Christmas fiends, dog. Like we are all about Christmas. And so to say yes to a lot of those Christmas things means saying no to some other things. And that's okay, because it's a segmented season of the year where I'm going to be driving up the quality family time a little bit. Work may be driving up some of the demands that it has for me and the responsibilities that I have within the workplace. And that may mean to say yes to those things, I have to say no to these 2.5, 3 hour long arm workouts that I love doing a couple times a week. So, and that's a little bit of an exaggeration. I'm not always doing 2 to 3 hour arm workouts, but I do love doing long ass arm workouts. So to say yes to one thing is to say no to something else. But just because we're saying yes to one thing doesn't mean we have to just completely abandon training. It doesn't mean that we have to completely abandon how hard we're and how much effort we're putting into the gym and on the mat. So when we look at this list of athletic qualities, I mentioned strength earlier before, but just to run through the list, we have strength, which is kind of the one that takes the longest to develop but lasts the longest. Next would be hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is pretty interesting because it does take a significant amount of work to build new muscle fibers, to actually like the muscle fibers, those cords. If you think of like a suspension bridge, they have those giant steel, I don't know, maybe they're made out of steel. I don't know what they're made out of, but they're made out of metal, right? Because in X-Men The Last Stand, Magneto picked up the Golden Gate Bridge, so obviously it's made out of metal. But those giant cords, if you ever walk up and look at one closely, you'll see that it's one giant cord that's made up of a bunch of other cords, made up of a bunch of other tinier cords, made up of a bunch of single strands of cord. And your muscles work very similar. Like you have this giant muscle belly that has all these thick, robust cords running through it. Then you zoom in on those and you're like, oh my gosh, this is made up of a bunch of other smaller cords that are bound together. And then you zoom in again, and it's like, oh my gosh, we have more cords that are bound together. And so the process of building new muscle tissue where you're increasing the size and the number of those cords within the muscle belly, that takes a lot of work, but those stick around for a really, really long time. I heard one time like they did a study where they looked at the idea of quote unquote old man strength. And they're like, why is it that like all these old guys, even if they look out of shape, they're like, they still got it, like they're still strong. And the results of the study, and hopefully I'm not like, like butchering this too much, was that once you build new muscle tissue, assuming you're not in like an extreme, catabolic state where you're like stranded on an island, like what's that movie with Tom Hanks, Castaway. Maybe if you were trapped on an island and you had no food, you would break down muscle tissue at a really, really fast rate. But assuming that your nutrition is on point and you're like not wasting away muscle, you don't really lose those built muscle fibers. Those just stick around. They may decrease in size a little bit, but it's not like they completely go away. And so this idea of old man strength, they may not be very jacked, but they still have all those muscle fibers that they built when they were younger, and that still plays a role in how much force that they can produce. So that just goes to show like, hey, it takes a lot of work to build new muscle tissue, but in the months of November and the months of December, if you just wanted to maintain the muscle tissue that you've already built, it doesn't really even take that much work. And we'll get into a little bit more about minimum effective dose training and how many sets per muscle group you need to maintain that muscle. So strength lasts the longest. Next would be hypertrophy. And then last thing on hypertrophy I'll mention is that hypertrophy is separate from how you look. You may look like pretty bloated. You may be pretty smoothed out. You may not be as vascular by the end of the holidays if your like nutrition is just kind of trash and you're like drinking a ton and you're eating a bunch of junk food. You may not look great. However, that doesn't mean that you've lost actual muscle tissue. When we think of people who are jacked, there are kind of like two different ways we can define that. We can look at someone like, oh man, that guy's jacked because he's super vascular. He got veins popping out everywhere. His skin looks like saran wrap. It looks like his muscle bellies are just super full. That's often more of a condition of the muscles being full of a bunch of nutrients and glycogen. There's not a whole lot of inflammation or water retention where it's kind of smoothing things out. The water underneath the skin is, it's not smoothing out how the muscle looks. That's one kind of quote unquote jacked. Then the other type of jacked is like you look at some of these big strongman athletes. They don't always have veins popping out everywhere, but they look jacked. They look like they just got big, dense, rock hard muscle. A little bit sus to say that, but they look jacked in a different way. And so when you're going through the holidays, it's important to remember that just because you look differently due to water retention, bloating, inflammation, muscle bellies not being full of nutrients and glycogen, just because you look different, that doesn't mean that you've actually lost muscle tissue, assuming that you're still doing the minimum effective dose of training to maintain whatever muscle tissue you currently have. Next on the list would be strength endurance. Strength endurance tends to fall off a little bit faster than just overall raw top-end strength and hypertrophy, mainly because strength endurance is a little bit more dependent on energy systems. It's a little bit more dependent on your conditioning a little bit, and we'll see a little bit later on the list that conditioning tends to drop off a little bit faster than some of those other athletic qualities. So, for example, say your max deadlift for a 1 rep max was 405 for just to keep things simple. So you can do 1 rep at 405 pounds. That's your top set, 4 plates on each side. Then say you did an AMRAP at 315 and say you got like 12 reps or something like that. That would be a little bit more akin to strength endurance, or maybe even if you did something a little bit heavier, closer to like, between 75 to 85% of your 1 rep max. So say you did 365, and say you lifted 365 for the deadlift, and you got like 6 reps or maybe even 7 reps. That would kind of be in that realm of strength endurance. Your 1 rep max deadlift, hanging out about 90% or above on that 1 rep max deadlift, is going to last for quite a while. However, you're probably going to see some drop-offs of your strength endurance happen a little bit faster. So say you take a month off of deadlifting and you test your 1 rep max. You might still be able to get pretty close to that 405 1 rep max deadlift, but say you tried to test that AMRAP again at 365. The first time you did it, you got 7 reps, but you haven't been really strength training. The next time you do it, 1 month later, you might only be able to get 2 reps or 3 reps. It just hits a little bit different. So strength endurance tends to fall off a little bit faster compared to raw absolute strength. Next on the list would be speed and explosive power. This does tend to have a pretty quick and pretty fast drop-off. And there are a couple reasons for this. It's very neurologically based. So, when you're being fast and you're being really explosive, your brain is sending signals throughout your body to recruit those big, powerful muscle fibers very, very quickly. And we have to make sure that we're kind of staying on top of maintaining that ability and maintaining that efficiency of how our body is recruiting those big, powerful muscle fibers. So earlier I talked about how powerlifting athletes and strongman athletes, they may take their last heaviest squat 2 to 3 weeks out from the day of competition. So they, like some of these guys that are squatting like 800, 900, 1,000 pounds, 3 weeks out from the meet, they'll squat a grand, and then they won't squat heavy at all for about 3 weeks. They step on the platform and then they smoke a giant PR. Olympic weightlifters, on the other hand, that's going to be a little bit different because weightlifting is the sport of powerlifting really should be called force lifting because it is really just a test of how much force you can produce. And then the sport of weightlifting, Olympic weightlifting, where they're doing the snatch and the clean and jerk, those leverage the athletic abilities of speed and explosive power a lot more than the sport of powerlifting. So Olympic weightlifting, much more akin to speed and explosive power. Don't get me wrong, there's still like a ton of raw strength and absolute strength that's being used in those sports. But you'll often see that weightlifters, say their meet is on a Saturday, they may still do like snatch and clean and jerk workouts all the way up to like the Friday morning before the day of the competition. And a lot of those workouts are focused on maintaining that speed and explosive power. So when we start talking about some different protocols to, maintain some of that speed and explosive power, those are things that you would want to put a little bit greater emphasis on during these months of minimum effective dose training, because the minimum effective dose for speed and explosive power is a lot more frequent than the minimum effective dose for something like raw absolute strength. Now, the next athletic quality is going to be your aerobic conditioning. And this one's a little bit different because it does take a while to really build out a big aerobic base. And in my experience and with some of the other resources out there that I've looked into, you do tend to see a pretty significant, or I wouldn't say significant, but you do tend to see a noticeable drop-off from your top aerobic conditioning within about 2 weeks. You typically, what most experts are talking about is they tend to say that within about 2 weeks, if you haven't done any aerobic conditioning, your peak aerobic condition will drop off by about 10%. So you train, 2 weeks later, you do nothing, You test again, probably going to be around 85-90% of where you were at before. And that's a pretty significant drop off. Like, you're going to definitely feel some of that a little bit. However, maintaining, say, above 75%, you can maintain that for quite a while with very, very minimal training. So aerobic conditioning is a little bit different because obviously as grappling athletes, like, we get a lot of conditioning stimulus when we're training on the mat, even if it's through a lot of different energy systems where we're using anaerobic energy systems and we're toggling back and forth, emphasizing aerobic energy systems. So you can actually maintain a lot of your conditioning without having to do a lot of conditioning work, assuming you're still rolling hard on the mat during the months of November and December. And I'll talk a little bit more about like specific conditioning workouts that I would recommend during these months. But those are that's the full list of athletic qualities that we want to focus on as we're going through this holiday season. I think a lot of times some grapplers have made mistakes of only focusing on one of those things. And they'll look at where things are at with their life, and they're like, man, I'm super busy with work, I'm super busy with the kids, I'm super busy just with holiday stuff. So all I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna do hypertrophy workouts. It's like, that's fine if that's what you want to do. Like, I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm just saying that probably isn't the most optimal thing if you're trying to be the best, most well-rounded grappling athlete that you can be and continue to develop your grappling athleticism. It's a really, really good idea to keep little pockets of training in throughout the week or throughout the month where you're kind of hitting everything on that list. You're doing a little bit of something for your absolute strength. You're still doing something for hypertrophy. You're still doing something for strength endurance. You're still doing something for speed and explosive power. You're still doing something for your aerobic and your anaerobic conditioning. And so I encourage you not to get a case of the forget about it where you say like, I can't really make it to the gym that often, so I'm only gonna, do zone 2 cardio once or twice a week. It's like, okay, zone 2 cardio is great, but you still got to keep getting strong. You still got to keep getting jacked. You know what I'm saying? So just something to keep in mind. So when we look at the one shift that I would recommend that can help you keep a lot of your athletic development, that's this whole thing called minimum effective dose training. Back in the day, I shouldn't even say back in the day, that's disrespectful. The coach, the amazing weightlifting and powerlifting coach, Travis Mash, he's still out there doing awesome stuff. He's actually getting in crazy good shape. I think he's trying to go for like a comeback in powerlifting and break his all-time world record again, which would be freaking nuts. But anyways, Travis Mash is an amazing strength coach. And he said something a few years ago back in the day that really resonated with me, and it significantly impacts how I train a lot of the grappling athletes that I work with every single day. And he said, know your minimums, know your maximums. And what he was saying by that is like everyone pretty much knows their maximums. If you go up and ask anyone in the gym how much they bench, they all know like, I bench, 325 or whatever. I definitely can't bench 325. But everyone knows what their max is, right? You're like, oh, what's your max squat? What's your max bench, deadlift, whatever. Most people know that. What most people don't know is their minimums. And the minimum is like, what is a number for any exercise? Pull-ups, dips, deadlifts, Zercher box squats, whatever. What is a number that regardless of how you're feeling that day, you should be able to hit? Like, you didn't get a good night of sleep, doesn't matter. You should still be able to hit that number. You broke up with your girlfriend, who cares? You should still be able to hit that number. You had a really stressful day at work and you're going to the gym after work. You should still be able to hit that number. Having that minimum is kind of like the hard deck. So, like in Top Gun, when they're doing those training exercises and they say like, hey, your hard deck is like this elevation, don't go below that point or else you're going to crash out. Your minimums is kind of like your hard deck, where if you, for whatever reason, are dropping below your minimums, that's how you know that something is really going wrong with your training and or something is really going wrong with your recovery. And so when we look at where our minimums are and where our maximums are, ideally we'd always love to be at maximum, right? Like that would be freaking sick. If like every single time we go to the gym, we're smashing a lifetime PR, we're getting more jacked than ever before, that would be amazing, right? But that's not life. That's not the way things work out. And so knowing our minimums gives us a range of kind of, it's like a litmus test for us to know like, hey, am I doing what's necessary to maintain the athleticism that I currently have? And if I drop below those minimums, that's a bad thing. I gotta figure that out. And when we look at minimum effective dose training, or we look at even like what Corey Schlesinger talks about with microdosing training, those kind of tie in with what our minimums should be. So for me, for example, when I was really rocking out on pull-ups, for me, I knew like, okay, regardless of how big I get, regardless of, whatever my training goals are, I should always be able to do 20 pull-ups. I remember the first time I got over 20 pull-ups, it was in high school, and that was something that I was thinking like I should, for the rest of my life, at least as, I was a little young and dumb, but I was thinking like for the rest of my life, I need to be able to always be able to crank out 20 pull-ups. And that's the minimum. And I haven't tested pull-ups in a long time, so it'd be pretty embarrassing if I did pull-ups right now and I couldn't get 20. But that was the minimum, where it's like, hey, if I get so heavy in this bulk that I can no longer do 20 pull-ups, that's a problem. And the work required to maintain that 20 pull-up minimum really didn't take that much. Like if I just was doing a few sets of 10 throughout the week and making sure like, oh yeah, like a few sets of 10 here and there, maybe like crank out a couple sets of 15, I know I can probably like just tack on a few more reps and hit that 20 rep mark. Same thing with when I was, training the sumo deadlift a lot. For me, I knew like, okay, 405 needs to be my minimum. Like I should always be able to rip 4 plates off the ground for a single. I may not be able to hit it for a set of 5. I may not be able to hit more weight for triples or whatever, but at least I should always be able to rip 4 plates off the ground and be good to go. And so to maintain that 405 deadlift, it really didn't take that much. I could deadlift like once every other week, maybe even like once a month, and still hang on to that, assuming that my form and technique was still dialed in. So that's what we're going to be focusing on with these protocols, and that's going to be minimum effective dose training. What is the minimum amount of work that you need to do to maintain some of these qualities? And as you're listening to this episode, I'm going to be giving you pretty much like a full training program on how I would structure each of these workouts to make sure that you're hitting the minimum effective dose for all of these athletic qualities. And the last thing that I want to mention before we dive into what that looks like is some of these things are going to be a little bit more specific to where your current strengths and weaknesses are. So there's one athlete that I'm coaching right now. He used to do like triathlons. I think he maybe even did like an ultra marathon. Like his conditioning it's crazy. Like he's got conditioning out the wazoo. So the minimum effective dose for him to maintain his cardio, he's already coming in with such a huge conditioning background. Like he doesn't get that exhausted at jiu-jitsu. So he can do a lot less minimum effect, or what would be the minimum effective dose for his conditioning. It's going to look very different compared to someone like myself, where I did not come from a marathon or ultra marathon running background. And so the minimum effective dose for me to maintain my conditioning is going to be a little bit higher. So as I'm going through these protocols, keep in mind that this is just like a general approach for how I would structure training, but you may need to make some tweaks to these protocols based on your individual needs as an athlete. Remember, the whole point of this podcast is to help you take back control of your training, to make sure that you have the education and the tools that are required to get brutally strong, pack on slabs of muscle, and never gas out again on the mat. So without further ado, let's talk about these protocols. So starting with strength, when building out a strength maintenance protocol, typically you really only need like 1 to 2 serious strength workouts per week. And how I would structure that is in each of those workouts, I would pick 1 to 2 compound lifts for the upper body and the lower body. If you wanted to split those up and do 2 workouts per week and do like, I'm going to do 2 compounds for the upper body on Tuesday, and then on Thursday, I'm going to do 2 compounds for the lower body, that's totally fine. You can do 1 compound of each. And like, there's a whole bunch of different ways you can mix it up. But typically to maintain strength, you're going to want to do 1 to 2 heavy strength sessions per week, picking 1 to 2 compound lifts for the upper and lower body. And when we're picking these compound lifts, I try to pick things that throughout the week cover a wide range of movement patterns. So I would not suggest, say your only lifting days are Tuesday and Thursday. I would not suggest doing heavy squats for your compound on Tuesday and then doing heavy squats again for your compound on Thursday. I'd change it up. I would do like squat on Tuesday, deadlift on Thursday. Maybe some sort of like quad dominant squat on Tuesday and then some sort of hamstring dominant like unilateral movement like a lunge or like a Bulgarian split squat, something like that. So just try to have a good spread of the compound exercises that you're picking. That goes for the lower body. That also goes for the upper body as well. So I would not suggest bench pressing 2 workouts in a row. Maybe one day do bench press and pull-ups. So you got horizontal pressing and vertical pulling. Then the next day, maybe you do some vertical pressing like a Z press, and then some horizontal rowing or pulling like a chest-supported dumbbell row. It's good to just make sure that you're kind of covering all your bases from a movement pattern perspective to make sure that you're kind of checking all those boxes. So 1 to 2 strength workouts per week, picking 1 to 2 compound lifts for the upper and lower body. The ideal is to keep the intensity of your working sets at around 80 to 90% or 8 to 9 RPE. And you may not always have like a prescribed 1 rep max for every single exercise, but the intensity and the effort that you're putting into each set should consistently stay pretty high at around 8 to 9 RPE. So for example, if for strength, if you're doing a compound lift for the lower body, like a Zercher box squat, you may have an idea of what your 1 rep max is in that exercise, and that's great. Just try to stay within 80 to 90% of that on your working sets. You may not have a quote unquote 1 rep max for a compound movement like a bent over row. You may not just know, like, who knows what their bent over row 1 rep max is. And if you don't know what your 1 rep max is for your bent over row, that's totally fine. Just keep the intensity or the rate of perceived exertion at around 8 to 9 RPE. Now, when it comes to sets and reps, we're going to be looking at something called a Prilepin's chart. I think his name was A.S. Prilepin or A.F. Prilepin. I honestly don't know, but he was an old school OG Olympic weightlifting coach. I think he was somewhere in Europe or like maybe he was in Russia. And he was coaching a bunch of just like ridiculously jacked and juiced out of their mind Olympic weightlifters. And he came up with this chart where he looked at all their training and the best guys that were getting the best results. And he kind of came up with this chart that gave some good, some people will say it's very prescriptive, like it has to be this way. I don't think it always has to be this way. I just think it's a good recommendation. I think it's a good guide to kind of give you some direction on, hey, if the sets are going to be this heavy, or I'm sorry, if the load on the bar or if the load in the dumbbells or the kettlebells or whatever you're using is going to be this heavy, this is kind of the range of reps per set that we should be going for and the total number of reps for that workout. So maybe I'll do like a whole nother podcast on Prilepin's chart and break that down. But basically, if you look at Prilepin's chart and you look at, okay, if the load on the bar is 80 to 90%, the ideal reps per set is going to be 2 to 4 reps for every single set. And the total number of reps for that workout is going to range between 10 to 20 reps for that workout. So that does give you some good flexibility on how you want to do it. So say we're picking a compound movement for the lower body, we do a Zercher box squat. You know what your 1 rep max is, and you load up somewhere between 80 to 90% of your 1 rep max. You're going to do 2 to 4 reps per set, looking to achieve anywhere from 10 to 20 total reps at that load for that workout. So you could do, 4 sets of 5, you could do 10 sets of 2, you could do 3 sets of 6. Like there's all these different ways that you can kind of like scramble the sets and reps and just do whatever feels best for you. So sometimes when I'm going through a workout like this and I walk into the gym, I know like, okay, this is how heavy it should feel. It should be like 80% or 90% of my max, or it should be about 8 to 9 RPE. I work up to whatever that weight is that feels like that. And I think like, okay, I got to do at least 10 reps and I probably shouldn't go beyond 20 reps. So I got to get a minimum of 10 to a maximum of 20. And so maybe I'll do my first 2 sets for 5 reps just to make sure that like, okay, within 2 sets, I'm already going to be hitting my minimum. and maybe I feel pretty good. And I feel like, dang, like those 2 sets of 5 are actually pretty easy. So then I might just do like one more set of that's kind of like an AMRAP, where I know like I'm gonna get a minimum of 5. I'm gonna push it and just see how many reps I can do. Maybe I can get like 6 or 7. Finish that workout or finish that AMRAP of 7 reps. That gives me 17 total reps for the day, and I feel pretty good. Other times I may go into the gym. I may go through the same process where I load up 80 to 90% on the bar, or I work up to a weight that's about 8 to 9 RPE. And I know like, man, like I got to get a minimum of 10 reps, but I feel absolutely cooked today. It's going to be a grinder just to get those 10 reps. And so what I might do is I might just do 10 singles. It's like, hey, I'm just going to do 1 rep every minute on the minute for 10 minutes. Then I'm done with this exercise and I can move on. So if you understand the ingredients of the recipe, you can start to make some tweaks and go from there. Like imagine you're baking cookies. Like my mom, she makes the freaking best cookies in the entire world. I put my mom's cookies up against anybody else's mom's cookies and I guarantee they're getting smoked. But my mom has followed this cookie recipe since like maybe even before my brother and I were born. Super, super old recipe. It's not anything fancy or anything like that, but she's done it enough times to understand like, hey, you know, this recipe on paper, it calls for you to do this with the brown sugar. Don't do that. Add a little bit more of this, or maybe, you know, it calls for this much flour. It actually tastes better if you do a little bit less. I honestly don't know what the recipe is. Like I've never baked cookies in my life like that, so I don't even know if that's accurate, but you gain enough experience kind of knowing the ingredients of this recipe, going through it a few times, you start to make little tweaks to give you a better result. You can also think of it as like in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, you know how like he's going through the textbook and there's little notes in the margins of like, don't try to cut the beans, you got to like squish the beans with the blade of your knife. And then he ends up making that liquid death concoction, and he gets like an A+ or something. It's kind of like that. So if you understand the ingredients of this recipe of minimum effective dose training, and you understand, okay, these are the things that are required for me to maintain the brutal grappling strength that I've already developed. Once you understand the ingredients of that recipe, you can start making small tweaks to fit the specifications of you as an athlete. So just to review, the strength maintenance protocol is going to be 1 to 2 strength workouts per week, picking 1 to 2 compound lifts for the upper and lower body. Ideally, you'd want to be mixing up the movement patterns that you're using from workout to workout. You're going to be loading the bar at about 80 to 90% of your max, or if you don't have an established 1 rep max, you're going to be lifting at about 8 to 9 rate of perceived exertion. For each workout, you're going to do 2 to 4 reps per working set, aiming to achieve anywhere from 10 to 20 reps total for that workout. So if you're doing a Zercher box squat, you load up 80 to 90% on the bar, you're going to get a minimum of 10 reps, a maximum of 20 reps for that workout, then you move into the next exercise and go from there. Last thing I'll say about the strength maintenance protocol is that it's important to pick exercises that feel really good for you and don't require a ton of setup. So for me personally, I know like if I'm going to do the sumo deadlift for my strength maintenance workout, it takes a long time for me to warm up for that exercise. Like I always want to make sure that like my adductors are warmed up and I do the most amount of mobility possible, blah, 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 blah. And like one little deadlift workout that ideally should only take about 20 minutes can take pretty much an hour because it takes me a while to get set up for something like that. However, if I just jump on a belt squat machine, I really like to just gangster around in the belt squat. It requires minimal warm-up, minimum setup. It's super easy to use. There's not like a whole bunch of like wake-up drills and like priming exercises that I need to do. I can just do a few warm-up sets, you know, work up and wait to my top set, bang out my working sets, and then move on. So when you're doing the strength maintenance protocol, we want to make sure that we're keeping the strength section of these workouts anywhere from like 30 to 45 minutes. If it's taking you longer than 45 minutes to get that total of 10 to 20 reps, you're either dicking around too much on your phone, you're chatting too long between sets, or you're doing something else wrong. I don't know what you'd be doing. But ideally, you'd want to condense that down to about 30 to 45 minutes and then just move on with the rest of the workout. You also want to pick exercises that just feel good. You don't have to do a barbell back squat. You do not have to do a conventional deadlift or a barbell sumo deadlift. as grappling athletes, we can do literally whatever exercises we want to do. So just pick the exercise that feels best for you. And so for me personally, like I really don't do deadlifts that much anymore. More just because like I'm having fun with other exercises, but some deadlift variations just usually don't feel good for me anymore. And that's totally okay. You can do whatever exercises you want. You don't have to deadlift. Pick exercises that are easy to set up and most importantly, feel really, really good while you're doing them. Next, we're going to move into the hypertrophy maintenance protocol. So if you're currently going through the Mat Jacked system inside the Strength Matrix, shout out the Strength Matrix. You guys can download a free training course at thestrengthmatrix.com/grappler. One of the training courses that we have inside the Strength Matrix training app is called Mat Jacked. And within Mat Jacked, I walk you through all the different things that you need to go through to pack on slabs of muscle and enhance your grappling athleticism. And one of the things that we talked about was what are the volume recommendations, so the total number of sets and reps that you need to stimulate muscle growth. And so if your goal is to grow muscle, you're trying to like add more contractile tissue to your body, most research suggests that you need about 10 to 20 working sets per muscle group per week, doing anywhere from 5 to 30 reps per set, assuming that you're taking each set very close to failure. So there's a wide range there, 10 to 20 working sets per muscle group per week is quite a bit of work, especially if you're doing like higher rep sets. Now, to maintain muscle mass that you've already built, it's actually a lot less. You can get by with only doing about 6 working sets per muscle group per week and training about 2 times a week and really be able to maintain a lot of the muscle mass that you've already built, which is awesome. So remember earlier how I talked about it takes like twice as much to gain, half as much to maintain. If you're doing 10 sets if your typical training week volume has like 10 sets per muscle group per week and you've hit a little bit of a plateau point, to stimulate that muscle growth even further, you may need to bump that up closer to 20 sets per muscle group per week. But if you just wanted to maintain, you can drop it down to about 6 sets per muscle group per week. We're still following the same rules of hypertrophy training, as in we're still going to be working with 5 to 30 reps per set, taking each set pretty close to failure, leaving only like 1 to 2 reps in the tank on every set. Now, there is a little bit of a crossover effect with the strength development rep ranges and the hypertrophy rep ranges. So like I said earlier, ideally for strength, you would only be doing 2 to 4 reps per set. Those aren't really going to stimulate a ton of muscle growth, but say you're feeling pretty good and you're like, man, I'm going to do sets of 5 to 6. You kind of do start to cross over into that hypertrophy territory a little bit. And so say you were doing a Zercher ass to grass squat, so to speak, and you're feeling really good and you do like 3 sets of 5, you get your 15 reps between that 80 to 90% intensity. That's 15 reps that are pretty direct on your quads among other tissues of the body as well. Those can contribute to the 6 total sets that you do for your quads when it comes to hypertrophy. So if you did 3 sets of 5 on the Zercher box squat to hit your quads, well, you just did 3 out of your 6 sets for your quad hypertrophy maintenance when it comes to maintaining the muscle mass that you've already built. So there is a little bit of a crossover in there as well. The other thing that you can do is you can make the hypertrophy maintenance just kind of stacked in with your strength work. So your strength work takes anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes, and then you kind of tack on some extra hypertrophy work after that. So say you were doing a Zercher box squat, really not the best exercise for hypertrophy, but excellent for building brutal grappling strength. You do your 10 to 20 hard working reps of the strength work. Say it takes 30 minutes. Then you have 15 to 30 minutes to do hypertrophy work, whatever you feel like doing. So maybe like, okay, I did a squat movement for strength. Maybe I do some like full range of motion RDLs, really tax the hamstrings. Maybe I do some ATG split squats. Maybe I get in a little bit of glute work or some lower back work and kind of go from there. So you can add the hypertrophy maintenance stuff as part of your strength maintenance protocol workout, or you can just have it as a separate session. So I did talk about in the strength section about how you really can kind of maintain a lot of strength with just doing 1 to 2 heavy strength workouts per week. If you can only go to the gym twice a week, you can make one of those workouts focused on strength, another workout focused on hypertrophy. If you have a little bit more time to go to the gym, well, you can just like spread that out even further, or you can even stack them as part of the same workout. It really depends on what you have time for and what you're able to maintain. And we'll talk a little bit more later in this episode about the importance of putting up points on the scoreboard. We're not necessarily trying to hit home runs every single workout. We're just trying to maintain and continue to consistently make those base hits so we keep getting points on that scoreboard. The last thing that I want to talk about when it comes to the hypertrophy maintenance protocol is something called blood flow restriction training or occlusion training. Blood flow restriction training, also known as BFR training, is so dope, dude. It's freaking sick. I got a pair of BFR cuffs a few years ago, and it was awesome. Essentially what the cuffs are doing is it's like you wear a cuff kind of above your bicep but below your shoulder, and then you wear one on your legs that's like above your hamstring but below your butt cheek. So like right where the cheek meat inserts into the hamstring, and then just right below where your shoulder kind of turns into your bicep. And what it does is it restricts some of the blood flow. It still allows blood to flow in to the muscle, but it doesn't allow for blood to flow out. And that phenomenon, I don't even know why I called it a phenomenon. I should say like just that thing that's happening. When that's happening in the muscle, a whole bunch of other benefits come from that. So it prevents you from being able to shuttle out waste products. So you're building up all these waste products, all these metabolites within the muscle, and you're creating a low oxygen environment, which has some amazing adaptations for conditioning, further stimulating muscle growth, helping maintain strength. It's great for recovery for damaged tissues. So when I tore my LCL, I did a ton of blood flow restriction training because it was just, filling my legs with blood and further helping shuttle blood flow and nutrients to the damaged tissues in my knee. So blood flow restriction training has a lot of different applications and a lot of different ways that you can use it. And one of those ways that you can use it is to help maintain hypertrophy. And there's a lot of really interesting studies where the guy that invented blood flow restriction training, his name is like Dr. Katsu or something like that. He was looking at surgery patients. He had them do these different blood flow restriction protocols, and they were actually able to maintain a lot of muscle mass even though they were bedridden because they just had leg surgery, which is freaking dope. So if you don't have like 3 hours to spend every day in the gym to try to get jacked, but you do have a pair of blood flow restriction cuffs, just tacking on a couple sets of some BFR training at the end of your workout can be a great way to maintain muscle mass. And a simple protocol that you can use is you get the cuffs and you put it on your legs or you put it on your arms. I would not suggest putting it on both your legs and your arms at the same time. That seems like a recipe for disaster. But put it on your arms for the upper body, and then you want to inflate it up to about like 40% of limb arterial pressure or limb occlusion pressure. At about 40%, that's a pretty good amount of pressure that still allows for blood to flow in, but doesn't let blood flow come out. So the goal isn't to shut off blood flow completely. Like we're not trying to have like our limbs fall off or anything like that. We still want blood to come in. We just don't want blood to be flowing out. So for the upper body, that's about 40% of limb occlusion pressure. For the lower body, that's about, or maybe I said upper body. Upper body is 40%. Lower body is about 60%. And so once you inflate the cuffs, they make electric ones that inflate on their own, or they make a hand pump you squeeze and it fills up with air. Once you have those filled up, you want to start building up quite a bit of fatigue in those muscles, and then kind of like keep hitting sets in that fatigued state, and you just hit them back to back to back. So a very simple blood flow restriction protocol that you could use would be you inflate the cuffs to your desired limb arterial pressure. You do a set of 30 reps for a given exercise. So for the upper body, that could be banded curls. For the lower body, that could be dragging a sled, lunges, squats, hamstring curls, really whatever exercise you feel like doing. You're going to hit a hard set of 30. You're going to rest 30 seconds, and then you're going to do 3 more sets of 15 reps. So that first set of 30, you're driving tons of blood into the muscle, and you get swollen up pretty quick. And your legs are burning, your arms are burning, it feels crazy. You take a very short rest period, and then you hit it again. Take another short rest period, hit it again. Take one last short rest period, hit it again one last time, and that's essentially the workout. You can do it if you can do a few rounds of that for different exercises. So say like, I think when I was doing it much more often, I would do the 30, 15, 15, 15 protocol for like banded curls, and then I'd do it again for banded push downs. For the lower body, I would do it for backward sled. So I'd like count my steps on each leg, 30 steps each leg, dragon sled backwards, 15, 15, 15. I'd take the cuffs off, rest like 5 to 10 minutes, and then I'd do the same thing again for my hamstrings, doing like banded leg curls or something like that. It feels absolutely ridiculous. It's so fun to do. So if you have access to blood flow restriction training cuffs, definitely check those out, because that could be a fantastic thing that you add on to the strength portion of your strength maintenance protocol workouts. So we just talked about strength and hypertrophy. If you're going to combine those in the same workout, you can do your heavy compound lifts and then do some more isolation movements for hypertrophy with the blood flow cuffs on, and go from there. It's freaking awesome. Now for speed and explosive power, there's so many different ways you can just like sprinkle in and microdose some speed and explosive power work. You don't need to do like super heavy power cleans or really like violently explosive banded deadlifts, which I love doing all that stuff, but you don't have to do that if you're just trying to maintain a little bit of speed and explosive power. And the protocol that I would suggest to maintain your speed and explosive power is just to microdose or sprinkle it in throughout all your different workouts. So if you're going to do a heavy strength workout, maybe as part of your warm-up, you do different types of skipping, jumping movements, maybe even doing some jump ropes, and maybe like right before you go into your heavy squats, you just do like 3, max broad jump triples. Like you don't have to do a whole lot. You can just do a little bit and then move into your main strength work. If you're going to do some speed and explosive power work for the upper body, right before you go into like your working sets of bench press, you can do like, all right, I'm going to do 3 sets of plow push-ups, 3 sets of med ball slams, call it good, move into my bench press work. There's so many different ways that you can sprinkle this in, and I'm a big fan of Corey Schlesinger and his idea behind microdosing training. You don't always have to have this giant long-ass workout that you do that takes forever. You don't always have to do that. You can get a ton of high-quality work in by sprinkling in these little micro workouts throughout the day or even throughout the week. So if you add just a couple explosive movements into your warm-up every single workout, if you're working out twice a week, that's awesome. That's, I wouldn't go as far to say that that's plenty, but that is something that's better than nothing in helping you maintain your speed and explosive power. If you are, spending all day in the office, like something I used to do at the old place I was living at, like, I work from home, and so like all day I would just be standing at the computer, and so sometimes I'd be like, man, I got to do something to like break up the monotony, and so like every 3 hours or every 4 hours, I would do 8 sets of doubles or triples on seated box jumps, like every minute on the minute for 8 minutes, and then I'd move on to something else in my workday. And even though that's not like a full dynamic effort workout, I'm not like hitting all the different movement patterns, I'm not doing all the different types of explosive work, even though it was like so minimal compared to a full body dynamic effort workout, I did notice that I was able to hang on and maintain a lot of that speed and explosive power and that twitchiness, and it really showed up for me on the mat, even doing something as small as that a couple times throughout the day. So we have our main strength work. I like to look at that as like the bedrock or the foundation of these minimum effective dose protocols. We got to make sure we're maintaining our strength. On top of that, we also want to make sure we're continuing to get jacked. We're continuing to maintain the muscle mass that we have. I was listening to a podcast earlier today at the gym, and one guy was talking about how muscle is the currency of longevity. Like the more quality muscle mass you have, the better and healthier you're going to be over the course of your lifetime. Now, obviously, like don't, conflate that with like, oh, look at all these bodybuilders who are dying. It's like they did not die because they had so much muscle mass. They unfortunately died because there are some other things going on with their health that were conflicting with their longevity. But if you're not a pro bodybuilder that's blasting a ton of gear and all this other stuff, and you're building more and more muscle, that's the currency of longevity, which I think is freaking awesome. So strength is the bedrock, then hypertrophy. After that, we have our speed and explosive power work that you can just sprinkle in throughout each of those workouts. So say you're doing a strength workout for the upper body, maybe you do your working sets of bench press, 2 to 4 reps at 80 to 90%, and you superset that with like a jumping rope, or you superset that with a couple like single leg hops, or vice versa. You're doing something for the lower body, you're doing your Zercher box squats, working your 2 to 4 reps at 80 to 90%. Between sets, do some plyo push-ups, do some med ball slams, just sprinkling it in where you can. Now, the next thing that you can do is focus on your conditioning, and the conditioning maintenance protocol kind of coincides with those 1 to 2 workouts that you're doing per week. And I'm a huge fan of doing both strength and conditioning together. They don't have to be separate, but if you are going to do them together, you got to make sure you're going about it the right way. So if you're doing your strength workout and you're going to close the workout with some sort of conditioning finisher, you got to make sure that the conditioning matches the same time domain as the strength work. I would not suggest doing a bunch of heavy squats where every set only takes like 5 to 10 seconds and then closing out the workout by going and running for 30 minutes. Is that the worst thing in the world? No, absolutely not. Like, there's tons of CrossFit athletes that do stuff like that all the time. However, in my opinion, and what I found to work best for the athletes that I coach, is making sure that we're being consistent in the signals and the stimulus that we're applying to our body in every training session. So if the goal for this strength workout is to be really strong, produce tons of force, lift some heavy ass weights, in those sets where you're only doing 2 to 3 reps per set or 2 to 4 reps per set, those working sets are only going to take anywhere from like 15 to 20 seconds, maybe 30 seconds. Like if you're doing something really heavy and you're taking a few breaths between reps of squats, but really they only take about like 15 to 20 seconds. If that's the case, then your conditioning also needs to follow that same time domain where your conditioning intervals are also within that 15 to 20 second range. So a lot of times what I'll do is, like, if I'm doing Zercher box squats for triples per se, I kind of know, like, I've been doing this long enough to where I know, like, yeah, most sets of triples on Zercher box squat take about like 15, maybe 17 seconds. So then the conditioning work that I do at the end of the workout is going to be 6 sets, 15 seconds on. And I typically like to use a 1 to 3 work to rest ratio for 15 seconds. So 15 seconds on, 45 seconds off, start a new set every minute on the minute, run it, and then I'm out of the gym. So your conditioning can be maintained with just a couple high intensity sprint intervals or high intensity conditioning intervals 1 to 2 times per week. So if we're building out like a full workout from top to bottom, we would do a little bit of mobility work, something to feel just loose, if you're a little bit banged up, whatever. You do your warm-up. In your warm-up, you probably sprinkle in some of those speed and explosive power exercises. Then you go into your strength work. You hit your 2 to 4 hard reps per set at 80 to 90% of your max for 1 to 2 compound lifts for the upper and lower body. Aim to get 10 to 20 reps for those exercises. Then after that, you do a little bit of hypertrophy work. Maybe you pick like 1 to 3 hypertrophy exercises. So for example, we do Zercher box squats. We need to get a minimum of 10 reps, maximum of 20 at 80 to 90%. So say we do like 6 sets of 3, that's going to be 18 total reps. We hit that check mark. Then we move into something for hypertrophy. We throw on the BFR cuffs. Maybe we drag the sled. Maybe we do some RDLs or like a more hamstring dominant kind of movement. Then after that, we can blast some conditioning, doing 6 sets of 3. We're doing 3 reps. That usually takes about like 15 to 20 seconds per set. So we're just going to do some sprint intervals for 15 to 20 seconds per set. We can also use Prelipin's chart kind of the same way, like, and kind of copy what we were doing in the strength work. So if we did 6 sets of 3 for the strength work, or 6 sets of, if you want to think of it this way, 15 seconds of squats, we can kind of just replicate that in the conditioning work, where we're also doing 6 sets of 15 seconds of work, 45 seconds of rest, and going from there. Now, if you wanted to work on your aerobic conditioning, That's going to be a little bit different because I don't necessarily suggest blending those two stimuli together. I don't suggest blending strength work with aerobic conditioning, mainly because you're sending two different signals to your body or two different stimuli to your body, and we want to focus on making the biggest adaptations to the stimuli that we're providing. We don't want to pull from one stimulus and pull from another stimulus and only adapt half as much for either one of those. It doesn't always mean it's going to be exactly half, but for example, just think about like what messages, what signals are you sending to your body? If you lift some super heavy ass weight for 6 sets of 3 and then you follow it up with going and running for 45 minutes, your body's going to be taking those signals and being like, do we put all of our efforts towards getting brutally strong, or do we put all of our efforts towards improving our work capacity and our aerobic conditioning? Well, we only have a limited amount of resources, so how about the strength gets half and the conditioning gets half, as opposed to just doing the strength work and then putting all of your resources after that workout into adapting to that stimulus, and then in a completely other session or a completely different session, you do all your aerobic conditioning, and then your body puts all those resources to adapt to that particular stimulus. That's how I personally choose to look at training. It's worked out pretty well for me. It's worked out very well for the athletes that I coach. And that's what I'd suggest for you also. So our anaerobic conditioning that we sprinkle in at the end of each workout, that's going to go with the strength work, the hypertrophy work, speed and explosive power work. The aerobic or oxidative conditioning that we're going to be doing, I believe is best reserved for its own session. And so how I would mix that into the week is like if you're doing 1 to 2 strength workouts per week for your, or 1 to 2 workouts in the gym per se for your strength, hypertrophy, explosive power, and your anaerobic conditioning, maybe on a third day or maybe on any extra day, you do a little bit of some aerobic conditioning work. And this has so many different forms that it can take. You can do traditional zone 2 cardio, or I know Joel Jameson calls it cardiac output training, where it's a sustained effort for 30 to 45 minutes, keeping your heart rate pretty high, but not so high that you are going to be like, you can't maintain it throughout the full 30 to 45 minutes. So typically the recommendation I make is like, hey, if you can run, go run. If you want to drag a sled, drag a sled. If you want to put on like a ruck pack and go walk and do that, that works too. But something sustained for about 30 to 45 minutes or so, focusing on nasal breathing in and out of the nose the entire time. That's one option. Another option is doing something that I call GPP giant sets, where you're still keeping your heart rate, I don't want to say it's like in the exact zone 2 heart rate range, because if you went only off of heart rate, it would probably be a little bit higher. But the intent is that you're doing a prolonged bout of effort or a prolonged bout of physical activity that's going to be a lower intensity than if you did like the really hard sets of squats or the really hard sets of sprints on the fan bike. And the way I would structure GPP giant sets to increase your work capacity, to increase that base of oxidative or aerobic conditioning, is pick 4 exercises for the upper body, pick 4 exercises for the lower body. You're going to do 4 sets for each of those 4 exercises, and you're going to treat it like a circuit. So what you would do is, say for the upper body, you pick banded face pulls, lat pull downs, kettlebell halos, and battle ropes. So you got like some stuff that's like a little bit, looks more like a bodybuilding exercise. You got some stuff that looks like a kettlebell flow exercise. You got something that looks a little bit more like conditioning. Regardless of what upper body exercises or lower body exercises you picked, you're going to do 4 sets and run through each set like a circuit. So you do the banded face pulls, you do the lat pull downs, you do the kettlebell halos, you do the battle rope, rest for 60 seconds, and then you hit it again. As far as sets and reps go for each of those exercises, you just want to do enough reps so that way you're working for about 60 seconds. So for like the battle ropes, you just set a timer for 60 seconds and you go for it. For the banded face pulls, that may be like 25 to 30 reps, but really it's just a matter of getting about 60 seconds of work for each of those exercises. You run through that about 4 times. It usually takes like 20 minutes, maybe 25-ish minutes to get through that. rest for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then you repeat that same format for the lower body. And for the lower body, I'm a huge fan of just like doing different types of sled drags. So drag a sled going forward, 60 seconds. Spin around the block, go backwards, 60 seconds. Go sideways to the left, 60 seconds. Go sideways to the right for 60 seconds. Take a 1 minute rest, run through it again. So you kind of have some options for your aerobic conditioning. Now, I know I just spewed a whole bunch of information at you guys, so I'm going to run through it all one last time, top to bottom. This is your athleticism maintenance protocol during the holidays. Remember, it takes about twice as much to gain, half as much to maintain. Don't get a case of the forget about it's where you just say, you know what, I can't hit a home run in this workout, I can't hit a lifetime PR, forget about it, I'm not even going to do anything, I'm just going to sit around doing nothing. Don't do that. Stay on top of your daily discipline. Stay on top of doing something. Something is always better than nothing. And you don't always have to do these crazy long workouts to maintain the progress that you've developed over the course of this last year. So the strength maintenance protocol, 1 to 2 strength workouts per week. You want to pick 1 to 2 compound exercises for the upper and the lower body across those 1 to 2 workouts. You're going to be lifting at about 80 to 90% of your 1 rep max. And if you don't have a 1 rep max established for some of those exercises, just aim to achieve about 8 to 9 rate of perceived exertion. You're going to be doing 2 to 4 reps per working set, aiming to accumulate anywhere from 10 to 20 reps total for that workout. For hypertrophy, typically it takes about 10 to 20 working sets per muscle group per week to grow new muscle tissue, anywhere from 5 to 30 reps per set, taking it pretty close to failure. However, if your goal is to maintain the muscle tissue that you've already built over the course of this last year, you can really get away with doing about 6 working sets per muscle group per week. The way you can do that is just by tacking on some extra, hypertrophy focused exercises after your strength exercises. The other thing that you can do is something called BFR training, where you inflate your upper body cuffs to about 40% of limb arterial pressure, lower body cuffs to about 60% of limb arterial pressure. You pick a couple exercises, you do 30 reps, 30-second rest, do 3 more sets of 15 with 30 seconds rest between each set, take the cuffs off, walk out of the gym with a wicked pump, helping further maintain the muscle that you've already built over the course of this year. When it comes to speed and explosive power training, if you want to maintain those adaptations that you've developed throughout the year, a real simple way that you can do that is just by sprinkling in some fast, twitchy, explosive exercises as part of your warm-up before you move into your strength work. So if you're going to be doing some heavy squats, maybe prime that exercise by doing some couple sets of box jumps, couple sets of broad jumps. Or you could just also do some explosive work as part of a superset with the strength work. So if you're doing some heavy squats for the lower body, maybe do some med ball slams or some plyo push-ups during your rest periods to get some speed and explosive power work for the upper body. When it comes to maintaining your conditioning, you can sprinkle in some anaerobic conditioning at the tail end of those strength and hypertrophy workouts, just making sure that the time domain of the condition work matches the time domain of the strength work. So if you're doing, say, 6 sets of 3 reps on the Zercher box squat, each set of Zercher box squats takes about 15 seconds, well, your conditioning intervals should each be about 15 seconds in length, also trying to achieve 8 to 9 RPE for each of those working sets. To maintain some of your aerobic conditioning during the holidays, you can do that very easily by just sprinkling in 1 aerobic or oxidative conditioning focused workout per week. You can do that with some more traditional zone 2 cardio or cardiac output training for about 30 to 45 minutes, focusing on nasal breathing the entire time. Or you can do something called GPP giant sets, picking 4 exercises for the upper body, 4 exercises for the lower body, each set of those exercises about 60 seconds in duration, running through it like a circuit 4 times through, resting about 1 minute between sets, resting about 5 to 10 minutes between giant sets. That is your holiday athleticism maintenance protocol. This is the exact protocol that I've used for myself over the last many years, and the same protocol that I use with tons of the athletes that I coach. And these protocols really came from just working with people who are going through real life. Not everyone has a pro athlete schedule where they do nothing but wake up, train, eat, sleep, and then repeat and do it all again. So many of us have full-time jobs. So many of us have families. So many of us have other responsibilities that I don't want to say like get in the way of the things that we love to do. But the reality is that we just have to balance some of those things. Like we have to balance lifting heavy and rolling hard with our responsibilities to our families, with the responsibilities that we have to our jobs and the people around us. And so as we go through these different seasons of life where things may take a little bit more time or things may take a little bit more of our attention, that doesn't mean that we should just abandon all the training that we're doing in the gym and on the mat. There is still so much that can be done to maintain a lot of the athletic adaptations we've made over this last year, as long as you're following some of the maintenance protocols that I laid out today. If you guys have questions about any of the protocols that I talked about today or anything else that I've talked about on this podcast, please drop them in the comments below. I love when you guys ask questions. So many of you guys are asking like some fantastic in-depth questions that I think like, you know what, I should probably just make that a full episode because like that's actually a really great question. So if you got questions, drop them in the comments below. If you want to get a kickstart on your grappling athleticism, if you want to kickstart your grappling strength, you want to stimulate some muscle growth, you want to begin building out your grappling engine, I have a free training program that you can download called Grappler Accelerator. In 30 days, we're going to kickstart your grappling athleticism and it has everything you need to begin enhancing your athleticism on the mat. Everything from strength, hypertrophy, conditioning, has a simple and clean meal plan, has a full sleep toolkit, recovery protocols, and everything else in between that you're gonna need. You can go to thestrengthmatrix.com/grappler to download it today. Lift heavy, roll hard, catch y'all later. Peace.